The smell of burning thatch mixed with salt air from the North Sea. Sister Hilda pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the scriptorium, her hands clasped so tightly in prayer that her knuckles had gone white. Outside, she could hear screaming. Not the screams of battle, not the clash of weapons, but something worse. The screams of women who wore the veil of Christ. Women who had devoted their lives to God. Women who had taken vows of perpetual virginity, now experiencing violations that the church would later refuse to describe in any written record. Through the narrow window, she could see the monastery courtyard. Smoke rose from the chapel where the Vikings had set fire to the wooden roof after ripping the golden cross from above the altar. Bodies of monks lay scattered across the flagstones, their blood running between the cracks in channels that looked almost deliberate, as though the stones themselves were drinking the sacrifice. But it was not the dead monks that transfixed Hilda with a terror so complete that her body had stopped shaking and had gone rigid instead. It was what was happening to the living nuns. Sister Aethelfleda, who had taught Hilda to read Latin and who knew the Psalms by heart, was being dragged by her hair toward the longships beached on the sand below the monastery. She was still wearing her habit, but it was torn, exposing flesh that had never been seen by any man, that she had covered for 20 years since taking her vows. A Viking warrior, his bare arms covered in strange spiraling tattoos that looked like serpents consuming themselves, held her by the back of her neck, like a man might hold a struggling animal he intended to butcher or to keep. Sister Quenhild, barely 16 years old, a novice who had entered the convent only 6 months earlier to escape an arranged marriage to a Danish lord, was screaming in a language that was no longer words, just sound, raw and animal and utterly unlike the pure voices that had sung matins in the chapel only hours earlier when the sun rose and the world was still ordered by prayer and the Benedictine rule. And Sister Eadburg, the abbess herself, a woman of 50 years who had governed the monastery with wisdom that bishops sought in their correspondence, who had copied manuscripts that preserve knowledge from Rome and Greece and the Eastern churches, was being forced to watch what the raiders were doing to her sisters before they would decide what to do with her. Her face was blood-streaked from where they had struck her when she tried to intervene. Her veil had been ripped away, revealing hair that had been hidden from all eyes for 30 years, gray and thin and utterly human, rather than the saintly abstraction the nuns represented in their covered modesty. Hilda watched from the scriptorium and understood that she was witnessing something that would never be fully recorded. The monks who wrote the Anglo-Saxon chronicle would note that heathen men had raided the monastery. They would mention that the church was destroyed and monks were killed and treasures were stolen. They would call it the beginning of the age of Vikings, the first great raid that announced to Christian Europe that a new terror had arrived from the north. But they would not describe what happened to the nuns. They would not record the specific acts, the particular degradations, the fates of individual women whose names they knew and whose families had paid dowries for their safekeeping in holy houses. Because what the Vikings did to Christian nuns was so disturbing, so violative not just of their bodies but of everything sacred in medieval Christian cosmology, that chroniclers could not write it down without committing their own form of sacrilege. The documents that survive speak in silences and euphemisms. The sisters suffered greatly. Unspeakable acts were committed against the brides of Christ. God permitted the pagans to defile what was most holy. The specific details were suppressed, first by the church which could not acknowledge such complete desecration of consecrated virgins, later by historians who assumed the chronicle's silence meant nothing particularly noteworthy had occurred, that these were routine casualties of medieval warfare. But the Vikings knew what they had done, in their sagas, told orally for generations before being written down in Iceland centuries later. They spoke of the Christian holy women as particular prizes, valued specifically because of their sacred status, desired precisely because possessing them represented not just human conquest, but spiritual dominance over the Christian God who had supposedly protected them. The sagas use language that Christian translators struggled to render into Latin without blasphemy. Words that describe the Vikings' deliberate inversion of Christian sanctity, their conscious desecration of what their victims held most holy. And a few documents survived, hidden in monastery archives, preserved in Irish monasteries that escaped destruction. Copied and recopied by scribes who knew these stories must be remembered even if they could not be spoken aloud. Letters between abbots discussing what to do about nuns who had survived Viking captivity and who were now considered defiled, unsuitable for return to consecrated life. Penitential texts that struggled to assign appropriate penance for women who had experienced violations against their will but who had survived and who now lived in a theological limbo that canon law had not anticipated. Tonight you will learn what actually happened when Vikings raided monasteries, what they did to the women they found there, what those women experienced during captivity, and why the church refused to record the details. You will learn about specific women whose names survived in fragmentary sources, whose fates can be partially reconstructed from evidence that was meant to be destroyed, but that escaped the flames. You will learn about the particular cruelty of violations committed not just for conquest, but for religious desecration, about women whose suffering was compounded by the knowledge that their own church would later reject them for having been victims. But before I tell you about Sister Aethelfleda's fate, before I reveal what happened to the nuns taken from Lindisfarne in 793 when the Viking Age began, before I explain why abbesses would later choose death over capture, I need to take you back. I need to show you who these women were, why they had chosen monastic life, what their vows meant in the context of medieval Christianity, and how the Viking raids destroyed not just individual lives but an entire religious and social system. If you want to understand how spiritual authority provided no protection against physical violence, how religious devotion made women targets rather than safeguarding them, how survivors of atrocities were blamed rather than supported by the very institutions that should have protected them, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe right now because what you are about to learn comes from sources the medieval church tried to suppress, from documents that survived in fragments, from archaeological evidence that reveals what written records concealed. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you know about Viking raids, because I guarantee this story goes deeper into both Viking and Christian history than anything you learned in school. And watch all the way to the end, because I am going to tell you about the nuns who survived, what happened to them afterward, how some found ways to preserve their dignity despite everything, and how the Viking Age ultimately changed how monasteries protected their women. Now let me take you back to the world before the Vikings came, to understand who these women were and what they would lose. In the 8th century, Christian monasteries across Britain, Ireland, and northern Francia were centers of learning, wealth, and spiritual authority that had no parallel in the secular world. These were not the grim medieval cloisters of popular imagination, but thriving communities that combined religious devotion with practical skills, that preserved classical learning while creating new works of art and literature, that educated both men and women, that owned vast estates and exercised political influence that sometimes exceeded that of local lords. Women played crucial roles in this monastic world. Unlike secular society where women were defined entirely by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or mothers, monastic life offered alternatives. A woman who took religious vows acquired a defined legal and social status, independent of family connections. She could own property through the monastery. She could exercise authority as an abbess governing both monks and nuns in double monasteries. She could become educated in Latin and theology and manuscript copying and medicine. She could participate in spiritual exercises and mystical experiences that were considered among the highest achievements of medieval Christianity. The decision to become a nun was not always purely voluntary. Families placed daughters in monasteries for various reasons: to avoid disadvantageous marriages, to provide for younger daughters when dowries were scarce, to fulfill religious vows made by parents, to secure prayers for family souls. But many women did choose this life genuinely and found in it satisfactions that secular existence could not provide. The letters and writings that survive from medieval nuns show women who were intellectually engaged, spiritually fulfilled, and conscious of their privileged position within a society that otherwise offered women few opportunities for autonomy or authority. The monastery at Lindisfarne, located on a tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, was founded in 635 by Irish monks bringing Christianity to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For more than a century, it grew in wealth and reputation, producing illuminated manuscripts, including the Lindisfarne Gospels, training bishops and missionaries, accumulating donations of land and treasure from pious nobles. By the late 8th century, Lindisfarne housed dozens of monks and a smaller community of nuns who lived in separate quarters but shared the church for Mass and divine office. Among these nuns was a woman whose name appears in one fragmentary source as Ethelfleda. We know almost nothing about her with certainty, but the name was common among Anglo-Saxon nobility, and women of aristocratic birth frequently entered prestigious monasteries like Lindisfarne. If Ethelfleda followed the typical pattern, she would have entered monastic life as a girl, perhaps at age 7 or 8, given to the monastery by parents who wanted to secure divine favor or who had too many daughters to marry off advantageously. She would have been educated in the monastery school, learning to read Latin so she could participate in liturgy, learning to copy manuscripts, learning the Benedictine rule that governed monastic life through a precise schedule of prayer, work, and rest. By the time she was in her 20s or 30s, Ethelfleda would have taken final vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The ceremony would have been elaborate, modeled on wedding rituals, with Ethelfleda dressed as a bride presenting herself to Christ as her eternal spouse. She would have prostrated herself before the altar while the liturgy of consecration was sung. The abbess would have placed upon her head the veil that marked her as a bride of Christ, a covering that she would wear for the rest of her life, and that symbolized her status as a woman set apart from the secular world, protected by both ecclesiastical and divine authority from male violence and sexual exploitation that were routine threats for women outside monastery walls. This protection was not merely symbolic. Canon law established severe penalties for anyone who violated a consecrated virgin. Abducting or raping a nun was not just a secular crime, but a form of sacrilege, an offense against God himself, punishable by excommunication and eternal damnation. Kings and lords who endowed monasteries believed they were securing not just prayers, but also safe refuges for their daughters and sisters, places where women could live without fear of the violence that characterized early medieval society, where women had almost no legal protections, and where marriage or sexual exploitation were the primary fates available to those without. Family protection. For 20 years, perhaps more, this promise held true for Ethelfleda. She lived according to the monastic horarium, rising before dawn for matins, chanting the divine office 8 times daily, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium during work hours, eating simple meals in silence while listening to readings from scripture or the lives of saints, sleeping in the dormitory with her sister nuns, surrounded by women who shared her vocation and who constituted a community bound by vows more permanent than kinship. Her body had never been touched by a man except perhaps her father or brothers before she entered the monastery as a child. Her sexuality had never been awakened, because medieval religious life did everything possible to suppress even awareness of sexual desire, treating the body as an enemy to be mastered through fasting and vigils and constant prayer. She thought of herself, probably with sincerity, as a bride of Christ, her virginity eternally preserved for a spiritual marriage that transcended and superseded any earthly relationship. And then, on a June morning in 793, Danish raiders in longships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne, and everything that Aethelfleda believed about divine protection and sacred authority and the inviolability of consecrated spaces proved utterly irrelevant in the face of men who did not recognize her god and who saw her veil not as protection but as a marker of value, an indication that this woman was special, set apart, a prize worth taking precisely because her religion considered her untouchable. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne was not the first interaction between Scandinavians and Christians. Norse traders had visited Christian ports for decades, buying weapons and cloth and wine, selling furs and amber and slaves. Some Vikings had even converted to Christianity, at least nominally, for political advantage or through marriage alliances with Christian kingdoms. But the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was different in scale and symbolism. This was not piracy or trade violence, but a deliberate attack on a major religious center, timed for maximum plunder when the monastery's treasures were on display for the feast of St. Cuthbert, whose relics drew pilgrims and donations. The Vikings who beached their longships on Lindisfarne's shore that June morning were experienced raiders who had probably sacked other coastal settlements in Scandinavia or the Baltic. They moved with military precision, surrounding the monastery before the monks could sound any alarm that might bring armed resistance from the mainland. Within minutes, they controlled the entire site, killing the abbot who tried to negotiate, cutting down monks who stood between them and the church treasury. For Aethelfleda and the other nuns, the attack would have been completely disorienting. Medieval monasteries existed in carefully controlled acoustic environments where bells regulated time and where the primary sounds were liturgical chanting and the scratch of pens on parchment and the rustle of robes on stone floors. The sudden violence, the shouting in a foreign language, the clash of weapons, the screams of dying monks would have been overwhelming sensory assault on women whose entire lives had been structured around quiet and order and predictability. The Vikings found the nuns in their quarters, separated from the main monastery by walls that were designed to preserve female modesty but that now served as a trap that prevented escape. One later source, an Irish chronicle written decades after the event by someone who had spoken to survivors, mentions that some nuns tried to hide in storage cellars beneath the dormitory. Others tried to flee toward the church, seeking sanctuary at the altar where Christian tradition held that God's presence made violence impossible. Neither strategy worked. The Vikings were methodical, searching every building, dragging women from hiding places, laughing at those who clung to altar crosses, begging for divine intervention that did not come. Aethelfleda was captured along with 8 or 9 other nuns, whose exact number the sources do not agree on. The Viking warriors who found them understood immediately what these women represented, even if they could not read the Latin inscriptions on the church walls or comprehend the theology behind monastic vows. These were high-status women. That much was obvious from their clothing and their hands that showed no signs of hard agricultural labor. These were religious specialists, the Christian equivalent of priestesses or seeresses, women whose role in their society gave them particular significance. And these were virgins, consecrated to their God, which meant that taking them was not just acquiring valuable captives, but was a form of spiritual conquest, a demonstration that the Christian God could not protect what he claimed to own. What happened next was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle with a single sentence. The heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. That word rapine is critical. In medieval Latin, it specifically meant sexual violence, violation of women, the kind of attack that could not be described more explicitly without the chronicler himself committing a form of sacrilege by forcing readers to imagine sacred virgins being defiled. But that single word confirmed what the chronicle otherwise tried to obscure. What made Lindisfarne different from ordinary military raids was not just the killing and plundering, but what the Vikings did to the consecrated women they found there. An Irish source, the Annals of Ulster, is slightly more specific. It records that in 793, the shrine of Columcille was broken open by the heathens and many of the treasures taken. The virgins of Christ were seized as booty. That phrase, seized as booty, places the nuns in the same category as the gold chalices and silver candlesticks and jeweled gospel covers that the Vikings stole from the church. They were valuable plunder, objects to be taken and used and possibly traded, women whose religious status made them particularly desirable to raiders who understood that their capture represented a form of psychological warfare against Christian communities. But these sources, fragmentary and euphemistic as they are, do not tell us what Aethelfleda experienced in the hours and days after her capture. For that, we have to piece together evidence from multiple sources, from accounts of other Viking raids on other monasteries, from Saga literature that describes how Vikings treated female captives, from later letters between church authorities discussing what to do about nuns who survived captivity, from archaeological evidence of Viking longship construction that reveals how captives were confined during sea voyages. Aethelfleda would have been stripped of her habit, the clothing that marked her religious status, almost immediately. Vikings valued fabric, and the fine wool and linen of monastic clothing could be traded or repurposed. But removing the habit was also symbolic, a deliberate erasure of the identity that Aethelfleda had worn for 20 years. Without her veil, without the distinctive clothing that announced her consecration to Christ, she was just a woman, vulnerable in ways she had not been since childhood, exposed to male gaze in ways that monastic life had carefully prevented. She would have been bound, probably with leather cords around her wrists, and marched to the beach, where the Viking longships waited. The walk from the monastery to the shore was perhaps half a mile, across sand and rock pools exposed by the tide. In her bare feet, with hands bound and warriors on either side who spoke no language, she understood that walk would have lasted forever and ended too quickly, each step taking her further from the life she had known and closer to a future she could not imagine. At the longships, she would have been forced aboard, possibly thrown into the hull where captives and cargo were stored during voyages. Viking longships were not large vessels by modern standards, perhaps 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, powered by both oars and sail. The space for captives would have been minimal, dark, cramped, reeking of bilge water and previous cargo. Multiple women confined together, some injured from the raid, all traumatized, unable to communicate with their captors, with no idea where they were being taken or what would happen when they arrived. The voyage across the North Sea, from Northumbria to Denmark or Norway, typically took 2 to 4 days, depending on weather and winds. 2 to 4 days confined in darkness, given minimal food and water, forced to urinate and defecate where they lay because Vikings did not waste time bringing captives on deck for sanitation. 2 to 4 days of seasickness for women who had probably never been on a boat before, who had lived their entire lives on a small island, following routines so predictable that each hour was marked by bells calling them to prayer. And during those days, the evidence suggests, the Vikings began the process of breaking down their captives' psychological resistance, of transforming consecrated virgins into something else entirely. The specific methods were never written down by Christian sources, but Saga literature describes Vikings as pragmatic about captives, viewing them as resources to be used optimally. Female captives of high status like Aethelfleda had multiple possible values. They could be sold as slaves, they could be kept as concubines, they could be used for short-term sexual exploitation, then traded, or they could be held for ransom if their families could be identified and contacted. But with Christian nuns, the Vikings added another dimension: religious mockery. They understood, from trading contacts and from previous raids, that these women's value to Christians came from their virginity and their consecration to Christ. The Vikings worshipped different gods like Thor and Odin, who were associated with violence and masculine power and sexual conquest rather than with the Christian emphasis on chastity and mercy. For Viking warriors who had grown up hearing sagas about gods who took women by force, the Christian reverence for virginity seemed not sacred but incomprehensible, a weakness to be exploited. Later, sources hint at what this meant in practice. A letter from Alcuin of York, a scholar and advisor to Charlemagne, written within months of the Lindisfarne raid, mentions that reports from survivors described acts, which one would blush to speak of, and which the enemies of Christ himself boasted of, committed against the spouses of Christ. Alcuin was writing to other church authorities, men who understood his euphemistic language, and he felt he could not be more explicit, even in private correspondence. But the phrasing suggests that the Vikings deliberately targeted the nuns' religious identity, that the violations were not just physical, but were designed to destroy the women's sense of consecration, to demonstrate that their God could not or would not protect them. When Æthelflætta finally reached Viking territory, probably landing somewhere on the Danish coast or possibly in Norway or Sweden, she would have been brought before the Jarl who had led the raid, or to whom the raiders owed allegiance. This was standard procedure for valuable captives whose fate needed to be decided by someone with authority. She would have been assessed like livestock, examined for health and strength and appearance, while men, who spoke no language she understood, discussed her future in words that sounded like the growling of animals rather than human speech. And then, at some point in the days or weeks after her capture, Æthelflætta's fate was decided in ways we can only partially reconstruct from sources that speak in silences and implications. To understand what happened to Æthelflætta and the other nuns captured at Lindisfarne, we need to understand the Viking slave system and how female captives were categorized and used within Norse society. The system was well established by the late 8th century, with clear distinctions between different types of slaves based on origin, skills, and perceived value. The Norse word for slave was thrall, and thralls constituted a significant portion of Viking-age Scandinavian society, perhaps 20 to 30% of the total population. Most thralls were war captives or their descendants, people taken during raids on Britain, Ireland, Francia, and Slavic territories. Female thralls were particularly valuable because they performed domestic labor, agricultural work, textile production, and sexual services that Norse free women were not expected to provide. But Christian nuns represented a special category of female captive. They were educated, literate in Latin, skilled in manuscript copying, and sometimes in medicine and herbal knowledge. They were often of aristocratic birth, which meant their families might pay ransom. Most importantly, they carried religious significance that transcended their practical skills. Possessing a Christian holy woman was a status symbol, a demonstration that a Viking warrior had struck at the heart of Christian power structures. Archaeological evidence from Viking-age Scandinavia reveals specialized buildings at major trading centers like Hedeby and Kaupang, where slaves were held before being sold. These slave markets dealt in captives from across Europe, and prices varied dramatically based on the slave's origin, age, health, and skills. A healthy young woman might be worth the equivalent of several cattle or a good sword. A nun, with her education and exotic religious status, could command significantly higher prices. Some nuns captured at Lindisfarne were probably sold at these markets within weeks of their arrival in Scandinavia. They would have been displayed naked or nearly so, standard practice that allowed buyers to assess physical condition and that served the additional purpose of humiliating captives from cultures where public nakedness was considered shameful. Christian sources mention this practice with horror, describing it as one of the most degrading aspects of captivity, particularly for women who had lived for years in monastery walls, where even their hair was kept covered. Æthelflætta was not sold immediately. The sources suggest she remained in the possession of a Viking warrior whose name does not survive in any source, but who apparently kept her as a concubine, rather than trading her for immediate profit. This was common practice with attractive female captives of high status. The warrior would use her sexually until he tired of her, or until circumstances made keeping her inconvenient, then would sell or trade her. For Aethelfleda, this transition from consecrated virgin to sexual slave would have been psychologically devastating in ways that went beyond the physical violation. Medieval Christian theology taught that a woman's virginity was a gift that could be given only once, that it was the most precious thing a woman possessed, that losing it outside of marriage was a sin that stained the soul. Even though Aethelfleda's virginity was taken by force, even though she had no choice and no ability to resist, medieval church teaching was ambiguous about whether she bore moral responsibility for what happened to her body. The theological implications would have tormented her perhaps as much as the physical abuse. She had vowed perpetual virginity to Christ. That vow had been broken, not by her choice, but broken nonetheless. Did this mean she was no longer a bride of Christ? Did it mean her 20 years of monastic life had been negated, that she was now a defiled woman unsuitable for religious life? These questions would have circled in her mind constantly, mixing with the trauma of repeated assault, creating a psychological torment that had no resolution because the church itself had no clear answers about the status of consecrated virgins who survived rape. The Irish annals mention that some nuns taken in Viking raids chose death rather than dishonor, a euphemism that probably means they committed suicide rather than accept sexual enslavement. Medieval Christianity considered suicide one of the gravest sins, ensuring eternal damnation, but some women apparently judged that preserving their virginity through self-inflicted death was spiritually preferable to surviving with their vows violated. We do not know if Aethelfleda considered this option or what prevented her from taking it if she did. What we do know is that she survived in captivity for at least several years. The evidence for this comes from a remarkable source. A letter written around 800, roughly 7 years after the Lindisfarne raid, by an Anglo-Saxon abbot to the bishop of Lindisfarne. The letter discusses whether a nun who had been held among the heathens and who had recently been ransomed could be readmitted to monastic life. The abbot does not name the nun, but the timeline and the specific mention of her connection to Lindisfarne suggest this might be Aethelfleda, or one of her sister nuns, from that original raid. The letter reveals several crucial details about what happened to Christian nuns in Viking captivity. First, it confirms that some nuns did survive for years, which means they successfully navigated the brutally high mortality rates of thraldom, where disease, abuse, and harsh labor conditions killed many captives within months. Second, it indicates that at least some families or church authorities attempted to ransom captive nuns, paying significant sums to recover women whose religious status made them symbolically important, even if they were now considered defiled. Third, it shows that the church struggled with how to treat these survivors, unsure whether women who had been sexually enslaved could resume religious vocations. The abbot's letter argues that the nun in question should not be allowed to return to monastic life, not because of any sin on her part, but because her presence would trouble the consciences of other nuns and would create scandal if word spread that the monastery housed a woman who had been a Viking's concubine. He suggests instead that she should be provided with a small allowance and encouraged to live quietly in the world, perhaps as a laywoman attached to a church in some supporting role that did not require vows. This solution, pragmatic as it might have seemed to church authorities, meant that Aethelfleda's survival would be punished almost as severely as if she had died. She could not return to the only life she had known for 20 years. She could not resume her identity as a bride of Christ. She had no family that we know of to take her in, her parents probably long dead and any siblings unlikely to accept a sister who had been a slave and concubine to pagans. She would spend her remaining years, perhaps decades, in a kind of social and spiritual limbo, alive, but permanently marked by experiences that her own church refused to acknowledge publicly while treating her as though she bore responsibility for her own victimization. If the nun in the abbot's letter was indeed Ethelfleda, then her story has at least a partial resolution. She survived. She was ransomed. She lived out her days in Christian lands, even if not within monastery walls. But 7 or 8 other nuns were captured at Lindisfarne in 793, and for most of them, we have no record of ransom or return. They disappeared into the Viking world, their fates unknown except through the general patterns of what happened to female thralls in Norse society. Some would have died within the first year from disease or abuse or the simple shock of transition from protected monastery life to harsh enslavement. Some would have been sold multiple times, passed from owner to owner as their youth and attractiveness faded and they became less valuable as concubines and more valuable as agricultural laborers. Some might have been taken on further raids, forced to travel with Viking warbands, serving as camp followers who cooked and cleaned and provided sexual services to multiple warriors rather than to a single owner. And some, a very few, might have survived long enough to be integrated into Norse society in more permanent ways. Viking warriors sometimes freed slave women who had borne them children, giving them status as free concubines rather than thralls. A few former slaves even married into Norse families, though this was rare and controversial. But even these women who achieved nominal freedom would have carried the trauma of their captivity forever, would have raised half-Viking children in a culture that had destroyed everything they once believed about divine protection and sacred authority. The Lindisfarne raid was not an isolated incident. Over the following decades, Vikings raided hundreds of monasteries across Britain, Ireland, and Francia. Each raid followed similar patterns, with nuns among the captives taken, with similar fates awaiting them. Some of these raids were recorded in sources that provide more detail than the sparse mention of Lindisfarne, allowing us to reconstruct other women's stories and understand the full scope of what Viking raids meant for female religious communities. In 806, 13 years after Lindisfarne, Vikings raided the monastery at Iona off the western coast of Scotland. Iona was even more prestigious than Lindisfarne, founded by Saint Columba in the 6th century, housing relics that drew pilgrims from across Christendom, serving as the burial place for Scottish kings. The raid was devastating, killing 68 monks, according to the Irish annals. But the sources also mention that women of the church were taken captive, a phrase that probably means nuns, though the exact number is not recorded. Among these women was someone whose name appears in a later martyrology as Blathmac, though this is a Gaelic male name and might be a scribal error for a female name that sounded similar. The martyrology, written 2 centuries after the raid by Irish monks preserving oral traditions, describes this person as a virgin devoted to Christ who was held by heathens and who suffered greatly, but who remained faithful. The text is frustratingly vague about the specific sufferings, using standard hagiographic language about spiritual constancy under persecution, but the phrasing about remaining faithful though her body was defiled confirms that sexual violence was part of her captivity. What makes this martyrology entry remarkable is its description of what happened when the woman was eventually returned to Ireland, ransomed after several years by her family. The text says she could not enter the monastery again, but instead lived among the laywomen, performing works of charity until her death. This matches the pattern from the Lindisfarne survivor. Even women whose faithfulness was recognized and who were commemorated as quasi-martyrs could not resume monastic vocations after Viking captivity. But the martyrology adds a disturbing detail that reveals how these women were viewed by their own communities. It mentions that Blathmac was avoided by those who did not understand her sufferings, for they saw only the defilement and not the constancy. This suggests that ordinary Christians treated ransomed nuns as morally contaminated, as women whose experiences had made them unsuitable for normal social interactions, even though church authorities officially recognized them as innocent victims. The stigma of sexual enslavement, it seems, overwhelmed any sympathy for what these women had endured. An even more detailed account comes from the Frankish realm, from the monastery of Saint Etienne in Strasbourg, raided by Vikings in 842. This raid is documented in a near-contemporary source, the Annals of Saint Bertin, written by a monk who interviewed survivors shortly after the event. His account, while still constrained by medieval reluctance to describe sexual violence explicitly, provides more detail than most sources about what happened during and immediately after a Viking raid on a female monastery. The Annals describe how Vikings arrived by river, using their shallow draft longships to penetrate far inland to reach Strasbourg. The monastery was surrounded and captured within hours. The monk chronicler notes that the Vikings made particular effort to capture the holy virgins, suggesting this was a deliberate objective rather than an opportunistic side effect of general plundering. 37 nuns were taken captive according to his count, ranging in age from girls who were novices to elderly women who had been in monastic life for 40 or 50 years. The chronicler describes what happened next with barely suppressed horror. The Vikings used the women shamefully, caring nothing for their sacred status, laughing when the women called upon Christ to protect them. This mockery of Christian faith appears repeatedly in sources describing Viking treatment of nuns. It suggests the violations were not just about sexual gratification, but were explicitly designed as religious desecration, as demonstrations that the Christian God was powerless to protect even his most devoted servants. The Strasbourg chronicler mentions one nun by name, Reshaped, who was the abbess and who was in her 50s at the time of the raid. Vikings typically preferred younger female captives who were more valuable as slaves, but Reshaped was taken specifically because of her status as the monastery's leader. The annals describe her as suffering every indignity before being killed when the Vikings left the monastery, apparently deciding she was too old to be worth keeping and killing her, rather than leaving behind a witness who might later testify against individual raiders if they were ever brought to justice. Reshaped's death was classified by the church as martyrdom, and she was eventually canonized as a saint, one of the few nuns killed by Vikings to receive this recognition. But the martyrology written for her canonization struggles with how to describe what happened to her before her death. It uses the phrase, "she endured what virgins should never endure," and notes that her sufferings were such that the Holy Fathers deemed it better to remain silent than to speak of violations that would disturb the faithful. Even centuries later, when compiling official saints' lives that were meant to be exemplary and inspiring, the Church could not bring itself to describe specifically what Vikings had done to captured abbesses. The 36 other nuns taken from Strasbourg disappear from the historical record. None were ever ransomed or known to return. They vanished into the Viking slave networks that stretched from Ireland to Constantinople, from Scandinavia to North Africa, a vast trafficking system that moved captives across enormous distances to markets where Christian women from good families commanded high prices from buyers who valued them as status symbols, as exotic possessions, as proof of Viking dominance over Christian civilization. To fully understand what captive nuns experienced, we need to examine the Viking slave trade more systematically, looking at how it functioned, where captives were taken, what kind of lives they led in bondage, and what archaeological and textual evidence reveals about the treatment of female thralls in Norse society. The Viking Age slave trade was vast and sophisticated, operating on scales that rivaled the later transatlantic slave trade in terms of the number of people moved and the distances they traveled. Archaeological excavations at trading centers like Hedeby, Birka, and Dublin have uncovered evidence of large-scale slave markets, including specialized buildings for holding captives, shackles and chains for restraining dangerous slaves, and written records on rune sticks that mention slave prices and ownership transfers. Female slaves were particularly valuable in this system. Norse society had constant demand for women to perform domestic labor, textile production, and agricultural work. Free Norse women spent their time on household management and weaving, which was considered prestigious and honorable, but they did not perform the grunt labor of carrying water, cleaning, food preparation, and field work. Thrall women did this work, and households competed to own multiple female slaves as status symbols demonstrating wealth and power. But Christian nuns represented a special category within the female slave market. Their education made them valuable for specialized tasks. Some were used as scribes, copying documents in Latin for Viking leaders who were beginning to interact regularly with Christian kingdoms and who needed written records, even if they themselves could not read. Some were employed as teachers, instructing the children of elite Viking families in Latin and Christian theology, which became increasingly important as Norse rulers converted to Christianity for political advantage and needed their children educated in ways that would allow them to function in Christian European politics. Others were kept specifically as concubines, their religious backgrounds making them exotic and desirable. Saga literature contains multiple references to jarls and wealthy Bondi free farmers who boasted about owning Christ women or veil women, terms that specifically identified former nuns. These references are always brief, mentioned casually as background details rather than as significant plot points, which suggests that owning a former nun was common enough to be unremarkable in Viking society, even as it represented ultimate degradation from a Christian perspective. The sagas also reveal that Vikings understood the particular psychological vulnerability of Christian nuns regarding sexuality. One saga mentions a Viking who kept a captured nun as a concubine, specifically because she wept when used, implying that her continued distress was part of her attraction to her captor, that her inability to accept her situation made her more, rather than less, desirable to a man who valued her suffering as proof of his power over both her body and her God. This is psychological torture mixed with sexual abuse, a deliberate infliction of maximum suffering that went beyond the physical acts to target the victim's sense of self and sacred identity. Some nuns in Viking captivity bore children to their captors. This created complicated situations that medieval sources struggled to address. Children of slave women were themselves slaves under Norse law, owned by the mother's owner, but children of Viking fathers could sometimes claim limited inheritance rights or could be freed at their father's discretion. For a former nun, pregnancy represented another layer of trauma. She had vowed perpetual virginity, had thought of herself as Christ's bride, now carried the child of a pagan man who had raped her, and faced the prospect of bearing a child who would be raised in Norse culture worshipping Norse gods. We know from later sources that some of these children did survive, and that their mixed heritage had significant historical consequences. Genetic studies of modern Icelandic populations show substantial ancestry from the British Isles, carried by female slaves who were brought to Iceland during its settlement in the 9th and 10th centuries. Many of these women were probably nuns, or at least Christians from monastery-adjacent communities. Their descendants spread through Nordic populations, meaning that the genetic legacy of Viking raids on monasteries persists today in millions of people who have no idea their ancestors include both Viking raiders and the Christian holy women they enslaved. The archaeological record provides additional evidence about the lives of female thralls. Excavations at rural Norse settlements have uncovered female skeletons in burials that show characteristics consistent with thrall status, buried outside regular cemeteries, placed in unmarked graves, showing evidence of malnutrition and skeletal trauma from hard labor and physical abuse. Some of these female skeletons show evidence of repeated injuries to forearms and hands, the kind of defensive wounds that result from trying to protect yourself from blows, suggesting lives of chronic violence. One particularly disturbing archaeological finding comes from a mass grave at a Viking settlement site, where 5 female skeletons were found buried together, all showing signs of violent death, including skull fractures and cut marks on bones. The archaeologists who excavated this site suggested it might represent the killing of thrall women when the settlement was abandoned or when the owner died, a practice mentioned in some sagas where male thralls and female concubines were killed and buried with their owners to serve them in the afterlife. If any of these women had been nuns, they would have experienced the final horror of being sacrificed to pagan gods they did not worship, denied Christian burial, their souls damned according to their own religious beliefs because they were killed without opportunity for confession or last rites. But some nuns in Viking captivity did survive long enough to be ransomed or to escape. The evidence for this comes from multiple sources, including letters between church authorities, penitential texts discussing appropriate treatment of ransomed nuns, and a few remarkable first-person accounts preserved in later compilations. The most detailed first-person account from a nun who survived Viking captivity comes from an Irish source, the Book of Leinster, compiled in the 12th century, but preserving earlier materials, including what purports to be the testimony of a nun named Gormlaith, who was captured during a Viking raid on an Irish monastery in the mid-9th century. The testimony was probably recorded decades after her captivity, possibly by a monk who interviewed her in her old age, and we have no way to verify how much of it represents her actual words versus later editorial additions. But even if it has been heavily edited or partially fabricated, it reveals what Irish Christians in the centuries after the Viking Age believed happened to captured nuns, and it preserves details that ring true compared to what we know from other sources. Gormlaith describes being captured at age 17, a novice who had been in the monastery for only 2 years and who had not yet taken final vows. The raid happened at dawn during the summer when the monastery was full of pilgrims who had come for a saint's feast day. She hid in the scriptorium but was found by raiders who stripped away my habit and bound my hands and drove me before them like cattle to their ships. The description of being treated like livestock, driven and herded rather than simply forced to walk, appears in multiple sources and seems to have been standard Viking practice for managing captives. On the voyage to Norway, Gormlaith says she was confined in the ship's hold with 12 other women, some nuns and some laywomen from villages near the monastery. She describes the darkness, the cold, the seasickness, the terror of not knowing their destination or fate. Most disturbingly, she mentions that during the voyage, the Vikings came down into the hold and used such women as pleased them, meaning that rape began immediately during the transport, before the captives had even arrived at their destination or been assigned to specific owners. When they reached Norway, Gormlaith was sold at a market in Kalpang, one of the major Viking trading centers. Her description of the slave market is harrowing. She was forced to strip naked and stand on a platform while potential buyers examined her, checking her teeth like they would examine a horse, feeling her muscles to assess her strength for labor. She was purchased by a bondi, a free farmer of moderate wealth, who took her to his farmstead somewhere in the Norwegian countryside. There, Gormlaith became a household slave, performing domestic labor during the day and serving as a concubine to her owner at night. She describes this period in minimal detail, using euphemisms that suggest she could not bring herself to fully articulate what she experienced even decades later when recounting her story. She mentions serving as wife without being wife, a phrase that captures the ambiguity of her status as a concubine who performed many of the same functions as a wife but who had no legal rights and who could be discarded or sold whenever her owner chose. She also describes the loneliness, the isolation from any Christian community, the inability to practice her religion openly because her owner forbade it. She was allowed no Bible or prayer book, was not permitted to make the sign of the cross or invoke Christ's name. She prayed silently in her mind, reciting psalms she had memorized during her years in the monastery. But she lived in constant fear that her owner would somehow detect her prayers and punish her for them. Gormlaith says she bore 2 children to her owner, both girls. The first died in infancy from disease. The second survived, but was raised as a free Norse child after the owner formally acknowledged her as his daughter, which meant she was taken from Gormlaith and raised by the owner's legitimate Norse wife. Gormlaith describes the pain of having her daughter taken from her, of seeing the child grow up worshipping Norse gods and speaking only Old Norse, of becoming a stranger to her own daughter who viewed her only as a thrall rather than as a mother with any claim to love or respect. After 8 years of captivity, Gormlaith was ransomed. Her family in Ireland had spent years locating her through the networks of traders and missionaries that connected the Norse and Christian worlds. They paid a substantial sum, probably equivalent to several years' income for a prosperous farmer, to purchase her freedom. She was returned to Ireland, but, like the nuns ransomed from Lindisfarne in Iona, she was not allowed to resume monastic life. She lived as a laywoman, supported by her family but socially marginalized, considered damaged goods unsuitable for marriage despite being only in her mid-20s. The testimony ends with Gormlaith reflecting on whether she had sinned by surviving, by submitting to her captor's demands rather than choosing death. She articulates the theological confusion that must have tormented many ransomed nuns. "I did not consent to my defilement, yet my body was defiled nonetheless. I did not worship the false gods, yet I lived among their worshippers and bore children to a heathen man. Did I sin by surviving? Would God have preferred that I die a virgin and martyr rather than live as I have lived?" The monk who recorded her testimony does not answer these questions, instead ending with a prayer for God's mercy on all women who suffer such fates. Gormlaith's account, even if partially fictionalized, reveals the psychological torment of nuns in Viking captivity. They were caught between religious teachings that valued virginity and martyrdom above survival, and human instincts that drove them to endure degradation rather than seek death. They had no good choices, only terrible options, with different spiritual consequences that their own church could not clearly define for them. The question of what happened to ransomed nuns troubled church authorities throughout the Viking Age. As more women were captured and some were eventually recovered, the church had to develop policies for dealing with survivors whose experiences did not fit into existing categories of religious life or lay life or moral purity. The evidence for these debates comes from penitential texts, collections of guidelines for confessors dealing with various sins and situations. Multiple penitentials from the 9th through 11th centuries include sections addressing women who have been held captive by pagans and who have suffered defilement. The language is remarkably consistent across these texts. The woman is not guilty of sin. She bears no moral responsibility for what was done to her against her will, but she is nonetheless unsuitable for certain roles in Christian society because of her experiences. One particularly detailed penitential from Francia, written around 850, discusses the case of a nun who was ransomed after 3 years of Viking captivity and who wanted to return to her monastery. The text rules that she cannot be readmitted to monastic life, not as punishment, but because the other virgins would be troubled to live alongside one who has known men, even unwillingly. The concern was not that the ransomed nun would somehow contaminate the others through physical proximity, but that her presence would force the other nuns to think about sexual violence and physical violation, topics that monastic life was designed to insulate women from contemplating. The penitential suggests, instead, that ransomed nuns should live in modest circumstances among Christian women of the world, supporting themselves through needlework or similar labor appropriate to their sex and status. They should attend church regularly but should not take communion as frequently as virgins, should dress modestly but not in religious habits that would misrepresent their status, should live quietly without drawing attention to themselves or their experiences. This solution effectively punished survival while claiming to show mercy. Women like Gormlaith and Aethelfleda, who endured years of brutality, who maintained their faith under impossible circumstances, who survived trauma that killed many of their fellow captives, were then marginalized by their own church that claimed they were too defiled to participate fully in religious life, despite acknowledging they bore no sin. Some Ransom nuns rejected this treatment. A letter from the early 10th century mentions a woman who had been a nun, was captured by Vikings, was ransomed after 4 years, and who refused to accept exclusion from monastic life. She appealed directly to the Pope, arguing that she had never consented to her violations, that she had maintained her faith throughout captivity, that her virginity of intention, if not of body, should qualify her to resume her vows. The Pope's response does not survive, but later references suggest he ruled against her, upholding the principle that physical defilement, even when involuntary, rendered a woman unsuitable for the status of consecrated virgin regardless of her spiritual state. This theological rigidity had practical consequences that extended beyond individual cases. As Viking raids intensified in the 9th century, many monasteries relocated inland away from coasts and navigable rivers, but some religious communities decided that the risk of raid and capture was so great that they should not accept women as members at all, effectively ending the tradition of female monasticism in vulnerable regions. Ireland, which had a strong tradition of women's monasteries, saw many of these institutions close or convert to male-only foundations during the 9th and 10th centuries, specifically because abbots and bishops concluded that they could not protect women and could not in good conscience accept the responsibility for women who might be captured and defiled. This meant that the Viking raids achieved a kind of victory that went beyond individual tragedies. They forced Christian society to retreat from one of its more progressive elements, the system of female monasteries that had given women alternatives to marriage and motherhood, that had allowed women to be educated and to exercise religious authority, that had created spaces where women could live without male control. The destruction of this system, accomplished partly through raids and partly through the Church's own response to the raids, represented a significant setback for women's autonomy in medieval Christian society. But not all captured nuns remained in Viking hands. Some escaped, and their stories reveal both the extraordinary courage of these women and the harsh realities they faced, even after gaining freedom. The most dramatic escape story comes from an English source, a chronicle entry from 878 describing a nun named Edgith, who was captured during a raid on a Wessex monastery and who escaped after 6 months of captivity in Denmark. The chronicle says she fled from her captors when they were drunk after a feast and made her way to a Danish Christian settlement, where missionaries protected her until she could be returned to England. The escape itself must have required remarkable courage and resourcefulness. Edgith would have had to wait for the right opportunity, would have had to escape not just from her immediate captors, but from the settlement where she was held, would have had to travel through unknown territory, where she spoke none of the language, and where anyone who saw her would recognize her as either a thrall or a beggar, and would likely return her to slavery. That she succeeded suggests she had help, probably from other slaves or possibly from Danish Christians who were sympathetic to her plight. But the chronicle's next lines are sobering. Edgith returned to England and to her home region, but she was not readmitted to her monastery. Instead, she lived in her brother's household, performing humble works and never speaking of her sufferings among the heathens. Even this woman, who had shown extraordinary courage in escaping, who had survived captivity and made her way back to Christian lands through her own resourcefulness, was still treated as damaged goods, unsuitable for resuming religious life. Another escape account comes from an Irish source describing a nun who managed to escape during a Viking raid itself before being taken to ships. She hid in marshland near the monastery for 3 days while the Vikings searched for stragglers and loot. When they finally left, she emerged to find her monastery burned, her sister nuns dead or captured, the monks slaughtered. She made her way to another monastery, dozens of miles away, and was given shelter, But again, she was not allowed to return to religious life, because the abbess worried that having witnessed such violence, and possibly having seen other nuns raped, would make her unsuitable company for innocent virgins who needed to be protected from knowledge of such horrors. These escape stories reveal that survival itself, regardless of how it was achieved, carried a stigma that medieval Christianity could not overcome. The Church's emphasis on virginity as a woman's primary virtue, combined with beliefs that physical violation somehow stained the soul even when it was entirely involuntary, meant that women who experienced sexual violence could never fully recover their previous status, regardless of whether they bore any responsibility for what happened to them. This theological framework created perverse incentives where martyrdom became preferable to survival, where women might rationally choose death over capture, because death would ensure their sanctity, while survival would ensure their marginalization. Some later medieval saints' lives celebrate nuns who committed suicide rather than be captured by Vikings, holding up these deaths as examples of holy devotion rather than as the sins that church teaching technically classified them as. The contradiction was never resolved. Suicide was a mortal sin, but allowing yourself to be raped was also considered a form of spiritual defilement. So, medieval moralists simply avoided addressing the contradiction directly and instead praised martyrs who chose death over dishonor, without examining what this choice meant theologically. The long-term consequences of Viking raids on female monasteries extended beyond the fates of individual women. These raids fundamentally changed how Christian society thought about protecting women, about the relationship between spiritual and physical security, about the responsibilities of religious institutions toward their female members. Archaeological evidence shows that many monasteries rebuilt after Viking raids incorporated much stronger fortifications. Sites that had been open communities with minimal walls became fortified compounds with thick stone walls, defensive towers, and gates that could be barred from inside. These fortifications represented significant investments of resources, demonstrating how seriously Christian communities took the threat of future raids. But fortifications could only do so much against determined Viking attacks, and the sad reality was that many monasteries concluded they simply could not protect female members adequately. The statistical evidence is striking. In regions of Britain and Ireland that experienced heavy Viking raiding, the number of female monasteries declined by more than half between 800 and 900 CE. Some were destroyed and not rebuilt. Others converted to male-only institutions. Still others relocated so far inland that they lost their economic bases and eventually closed from lack of resources. This decline in female monasteries had cascading effects on women's options in medieval society. With fewer religious houses accepting women, aristocratic families had fewer places to send daughters they did not want to marry off. This put downward pressure on marriage ages as families married daughters younger to avoid the problem of what to do with them if monastery placement was not available. It also meant fewer women received the education that monasteries provided, contributing to declining female literacy rates in regions affected by Viking raids. The Viking raids thus achieved a kind of systematic destruction of women's autonomy that went far beyond the individual tragedies of women like Aethelfleda and Gormlaith. By making female monasteries unsafe, by forcing Christian society to abandon its commitment to protecting women in religious life, the raids pushed women back into purely domestic roles, defined entirely by relationships to men as daughters, wives, and mothers. The alternative spaces where women could live otherwise, the monasteries that had provided education and authority and independence for women of all social classes who chose religious vocations, were destroyed or severely diminished across huge regions of Christian Europe. This was not an intentional goal of Viking raids in any strategic sense. The Vikings were not trying to undermine Christian women's autonomy as a deliberate policy. They raided monasteries for gold and silver and valuable manuscripts, and they took women as captives because female slaves were valuable commodities. But the cumulative effect of hundreds of raids over generations was to make female monasticism untenable in many regions, and this had consequences that lasted long after the Viking Age ended. By the late 9th century, Christian authorities were developing more systematic responses to the Viking threat beyond simple fortifications. These responses included diplomatic negotiations, paying tribute to buy peace, converting Vikings to Christianity to make them less likely to attack Christian sites, and developing military forces capable of defending against raids. One surprising response was the establishment of what might be called prisoner exchange or ransom networks. Churches and monasteries across Christian Europe began setting aside funds specifically for ransoming captives from Viking slavery. This was formalized through religious orders dedicated to this purpose, with monks and clergy negotiating with Viking traders to identify and purchase Christian captives for return to their homelands. These ransom efforts had mixed success. They did manage to recover some captives, including some nuns whose stories we know from the sources already discussed. But the existence of a reliable ransom market also created perverse incentives for Vikings, who learned that Christian captives, especially high-status ones like nuns, could be held for ransom rather than simply enslaved, potentially making them more valuable than other categories of captives. This may have actually increased the targeting of monasteries and the deliberate capture of religious women who Viking raiders knew would command high ransom prices. The ransom negotiations themselves must have been agonizing for all involved. Christian negotiators had to interact with Viking raiders and slavers to treat them as legitimate business partners rather than as the murderers and rapists that Christian sources universally condemned them as being. They had to set values on human lives, deciding how much to pay for a nun's freedom while knowing that every coin paid enriched the Vikings who would use that wealth to fund future raids. And they had to choose which captives to ransom when resources were limited, creating terrible ethical dilemmas about whose lives to prioritize. The women being ransomed had to deal with their own complicated feelings. Being ransomed meant survival and return to Christian lands, but it also meant returning to communities that would view them as defiled, that would exclude them from religious life, that would treat them as permanent reminders of Christian vulnerability, rather than as survivors who deserved support and reintegration. Some women apparently refused ransom, preferring to remain in Viking lands where their status was at least clear as thralls, rather than returning to Christian society where their status would be ambiguous and shameful. One remarkable source, a letter from a bishop to a monastery in northern Francia, discusses a nun who was offered ransom after 5 years of captivity and who declined, sending word through the negotiator that she preferred to remain where she was than to return to be shunned by those who should welcome her. The bishop who received this message was clearly troubled by it, writing to other church authorities asking whether the woman was in some sense choosing sin by remaining with pagans, or whether her decision reflected a legitimate judgment that Christian society had failed her and that she bore no obligation to return to a community that would marginalize her. This case raises profound questions about the relationship between religious institutions and the people they claim to serve. When the church established the monastery system, it promised women who took religious vows that they would be protected, that their virginity would be safeguarded by both spiritual and practical means, that they would never be vulnerable to the sexual exploitation that was endemic in secular medieval society. When that promise was broken by Viking raids, when consecrated virgins were raped and enslaved, the church's response was to exclude survivors from full participation in religious life on the grounds that they were defiled, even while acknowledging they bore no sin. This institutional failure is one of the darkest aspects of the entire story. The women who suffered most, who endured unimaginable trauma while maintaining their faith under impossible circumstances, were then punished for surviving through no fault of their own. And this pattern continued not just during the Viking Age, but for centuries afterward, with Christian institutions consistently failing to support women who survived sexual violence, instead treating them as morally compromised, regardless of the circumstances of their victimization. The Viking Age gradually ended in the 10th and 11th centuries as Scandinavian kingdoms converted to Christianity, as the raiders themselves became settled rulers of territories they had conquered, as military resistance to Viking raids became more effective. The last major Viking raid on a monastery occurred in the early 11th century, and by 1200, the Scandinavian kingdoms were fully Christian and integrated into European political and religious structures. But the trauma of the Viking Age persisted in Christian memory for centuries afterward. Liturgical texts from regions that had experienced heavy Viking raiding included special prayers asking God to protect against heathen fury and to safeguard the brides of Christ from defilement. These prayers continued to be recited long after the Viking threat had ended, suggesting that the psychological wound had not healed even when the physical danger was past. For women religious, the Viking Age left permanent marks on how female monasticism was organized and protected. The open, welcoming monasteries of the pre-Viking era, places where women could live in relative peace and where security came from their consecrated status rather than from walls and weapons, never fully returned. Medieval monasteries remained fortified spaces separated from the secular world by barriers that were as much physical as spiritual, and this defensive posture shaped female religious life for the remainder of the medieval period and beyond. The individual women who suffered during the Viking Age, women like Aethelfleda and Gormlaith and Richilda and Edgith and the dozens or hundreds of others whose names do not survive, are mostly forgotten by history. They appear in sources only as fragments, as euphemistic phrases about sufferings and defilement, as statistical entries in chronicles listing numbers of monasteries raided and captives taken, as theological problems for church authorities debating whether ransom nuns could resume religious life. But their suffering was real. The psychological and physical trauma they endured was as severe as anything that happens to victims of modern conflicts and atrocities. The rape, the enslavement, the forced separation from everything familiar, the constant fear, the loss of identity, the bearing of children to men they despised, the isolation from religious community and practice that had given meaning to their lives, the eventual marginalization by their own societies if they survived. All of this represents human suffering on a scale and of a type that should not be forgotten or dismissed as merely routine casualties of medieval warfare. What makes their suffering particularly poignant is how completely it was preventable. These were women who had specifically chosen religious life in part to escape the very dangers that then found them in monastery walls. They had been promised protection, had devoted their lives to God in exchange for safety and purpose, only to discover that consecration provided no shield against violence, that divine protection was either absent or manifested in ways that required them to endure rather than to be rescued, that survival would be punished almost as severely as death. The question Sister Hilda faced as she hid in the scriptorium at Lindisfarne, watching her sisters being dragged to Viking ships, the question that Gormlaith articulated decades after her captivity, the question that every nun who survived Viking raids must have asked, was fundamentally about whether God's protection meant anything at all. They had been taught that consecrated virgins were under divine protection, that their vows established a relationship with Christ that transcended earthly vulnerability. The Viking raids proved this was false, or at least that divine protection operated in ways that had nothing to do with preventing suffering, and everything to do with demanding that women endure unimaginable trauma while maintaining faith. Medieval theologians never satisfactorily answered this question. They could not explain why God allowed consecrated virgins to be raped and enslaved. They could not reconcile the promise of divine protection with the reality of Viking raiders killing and plundering at will. They fell back on vague statements about mysterious divine purposes and about suffering being a form of spiritual test. But these platitudes offered cold comfort to women experiencing trauma or to communities dealing with survivors whose suffering the church itself then compounded through theological rigidity and social exclusion. If you found this investigation into one of medieval history's darkest chapters compelling and want to learn more about how historical institutions failed the people they claimed to protect, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss future videos about suppressed histories and stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about the past. Share this video with anyone interested in medieval history or in understanding how religious institutions respond to systematic violence against women. Leave a comment telling me what you think about how the church treated ransom nuns, because this pattern of blaming victims for their own victimization is something we need to recognize and challenge wherever it appears. Remember these women not as abstractions or as statistics, but as individuals who lost everything. Remember Fleda, who spent 20 years as a consecrated virgin only to be enslaved and violated, and who may have been the nun eventually ransomed, but excluded from returning to monastic life. Remember Gormlaith, who survived 8 years of captivity, only to be socially marginalized by the community that should have celebrated her survival. Remember Richilda, killed by her captors after suffering every degradation, whose martyrdom was celebrated by the same church that would have excluded her from religious life if she had survived. Remember that the sources describing these women's sufferings were written by people who could not bring themselves to describe specifically what happened, who used euphemisms and silences that obscured the full reality of what nuns in Viking captivity experienced. The phrase "suffered greatly" encompasses rape, torture, enslavement, forced pregnancy, psychological torment, cultural and linguistic isolation, and spiritual crisis that no brief phrase can adequately capture. When medieval chronicles say that unspeakable acts were committed against consecrated virgins, they mean acts so violative that describing them would itself constitute a form of participation in the desecration. And remember that the Viking Age destruction of female monasteries represented not just individual tragedies, but a systematic undermining of women's autonomy in medieval Christian society. The raids forced the closure or conversion of hundreds of institutions that had given women alternatives to purely domestic roles, that had educated women, that had allowed women to exercise religious and administrative authority. The loss of these spaces pushed women back into dependence on men, into lives defined entirely by marriage and motherhood, into illiteracy and political irrelevance. The patterns evident in this history, the institutional failure to protect vulnerable people, the tendency to blame victims for their own suffering, the prioritization of theological purity over human welfare, these patterns appear throughout history in different forms. Understanding how they manifested during the Viking Age helps us recognize them in other contexts, helps us see how institutions claiming to serve people can instead compound their suffering through rigid adherence to rules that prioritize abstraction over compassion. The ruins of Lindisfarne still stand on their tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, preserved as historical monuments, visited by tourists who learn about the raid of 793 as the beginning of the Viking Age. But the interpretation panels and guidebooks generally do not discuss in detail what happened to the nuns, focusing instead on the dramatic military aspects of the raid and its significance for British history. The specific fates of Sister Fleda and her sister nuns remain mostly unspoken, their suffering condensed into brief phrases that do not convey the full horror of what they experienced. Similarly, the other monasteries raided during the Viking Age exist now primarily as archaeological sites or as rebuilt structures that bear little resemblance to their original forms. The women who lived and suffered in these places are remembered, if at all, as anonymous victims of historical forces beyond their control. But they were not anonymous. They were individuals with names and families and hopes and fears, women who made choices about their lives and who had those choices destroyed by violence they did not deserve and could not prevent. This video has told their stories as well as fragmentary sources allow, has honored their memories by refusing to let euphemism and silence obscure what they endured, has insisted that their suffering matters and should be remembered even when it makes us uncomfortable. The Vikings who raided monasteries are often romanticized in modern popular culture as adventurous explorers and skilled warriors. And while those characterizations are not entirely wrong, they obscure the reality that Viking success was built partly on systematic violence against defenseless people, including women who had explicitly chosen religious life in hope of escaping exactly such violence. If understanding this history makes you uncomfortable, if it challenges romantic notions about the Viking Age or raises difficult questions about how religious institutions treat survivors of sexual violence, then the discomfort is appropriate. History should sometimes be uncomfortable. Stories about systematic cruelty and institutional failure should trouble us. And the specific story of what Vikings did to Christian nuns was forbidden to record precisely because it was so deeply troubling that medieval Christians could not contemplate it without experiencing spiritual and psychological distress. But we do not honor victims by remaining silent about their suffering. We do not serve truth by perpetuating euphemisms that obscure historical realities. And we do not learn from the past if we refuse to examine its darkest chapters with honesty and specificity. The women who suffered during the Viking Age deserve better than to be reduced to brief chronicle entries about unspeakable acts. They deserve to be remembered as whole human beings whose suffering was real and whose survival, when it occurred, was testimony to human resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring histories that challenge comfortable narratives and that reveal truths about power, violence, and institutional failure that remain relevant today.